So let's get started, shall we? First of all, thank you very, very much, everybody, for joining us. My name is Jon Ward. I'm Agile Coach. I've been Agile coaching since 2007. I'm a SAFe SPC. I've been just doing the Disciplined Agile Senior Scrum Master qualification, and with a group of about 75 people around the world, we've been defining the curriculum and the standards for the DA, Disciplined Agile Value Stream Consultant examination. So basically, currently I'm working in a Agile transformation in part of British Telecom, and I've got 5,000 people that I'm working with, and some of this content is material that we've used in terms of introducing senior coaches and Scrum Masters to agile techniques and so on. So the role of the coach, then, my view of the coach is that the job of the coach is to improve the performance of the team, and that could be a team at a single squad or a single Scrum team, or it could be a leadership team and anywhere in between. But that's basically the job of a coach. So I started to think about how can we look at when to coach an Agile team. And someone said to me about 6 weeks ago that it's always a challenge for a coach to know when to start to coach the teams, when to start to do an intervention and so on. But basically, one of the other people on the DAVSC course said to me that if your team is doing the same today as it was 3 months ago, then it's not learning or improvement. And basically, continuous improvement is not working. And I thought, well, I hadn't really thought about that. But it's not only the team, it's also about the coach. So if the coach is doing the same thing today as it was 3 months ago, then we're not improving and we're not learning. So it gave me quite a nice little dimension to start to think about how can we improve our coaching and how can we improve the performance of our teams. I talked a little bit in my last webinar about interventions with the team, and I talked about I've got a coach up there, a male and female, because I didn't want to upset anybody, and I've got a Scrum Master that's male and female because I didn't want to upset anybody either. So but basically what the coach is doing is making observations and analysis based on what's happening with the team, the Scrum Master, the relationships, and all of those sort of things. And then what the coach does is then develop a coaching plan. Now, if you remember, I talked about in the last webinar about having a coaching plan, and I'll come back to that in a second. But basically, the coaching plan is saying, I've seen something, I'd like to change it. I think I can help the team in this regard. Okay, so the question then is, which intervention style to use? What do I need to do? So we talked a little bit about coaching plan with a set of measurable interim targets. And you can see on the left-hand side here, we've got, the goal is to introduce predictable delivery, and we might do improve requirements, then we might get better planning and so on. So basically what we've got here is a coaching plan that has about 4 or 5 different elements to it. And what you've got is that in the coaching plan, you'll be using, the different types of techniques. So you don't think for 1 minute that you use the same technique for every time that you interact with the same team. Okay. So for example, if you've already trained the team in, let's say, acceptance test driven development, you might need to do some mentoring to actually help them understand it more in the context. On the other hand, if your product owner is a brand new person, you might need to do training. You might need to do some facilitating and so on. So basically, in order to get to your goal, or the team's goal, that's better, of predictable delivery, so we're doing a stages and steps through the plan. And that plan there might take you 2 or 3 sprints to go through the whole plan, but you're still looking at plan, do, study, adjust, so that if you find that the training with the product owner solved your problem with sprint planning, so you wouldn't bother with doing that intervention at that point. I'm talking about teaching, mentoring, facilitating, and professional coaching because I'm looking at something called the Agile Coaching Competency Framework, which is Elisa Adkins, from Elisa Adkins' book, Coaching Agile Teams. At the top level, we've got a lean agile practitioner. Now, a coach can't be a coach without knowing in-depth understanding of agile practices and frameworks and techniques and so on. At the bottom level, we've got the three masteries. The three masteries are the knowledge of the situation regarding to technical practice, such as testing, automation, CI/CD, and so on. There's business mastery, which is looking at the how does the business strategy gets interpreted and delivered using Agile. And then the last thing is about transformation mastery. So if you look in the middle there, you've got teaching, mentoring, facilitating, and coaching. So teaching is about offering the right knowledge to the people, the team, at the right time and in the right way. Mentoring is about able to impart your experience in the context of the others. So you've already trained them. So now you want to say, okay, in these circumstances, this is how you do whatever it is. Facilitating, on the other hand, is a neutral stance. It's sort of you're providing a framework for the team to explore and enable them to come to decisions and so on. Similarly, coaching is about the team expressing themselves and they are owning the direction of travel, if you like. The thing I've got, there's a bit of a problem I've got with this, because if you think about the stance about teaching, mentoring, facilitating, and coaching, all of those four areas are assuming that something's going wrong. But I equally believe that there is another coaching element which is affirming. You know, if you think of children, or if you think of, I've got two dogs. If you want to train a dog, you give them a reward when they do something right. And similarly with children, and same with teams. You know, there's still this affirming piece about catching them doing something right and saying, you know what, Fred, that was really good. That was good. Great. You really managed that event very well. Okay. And I think just to think about the negative side is a very wrong thing to do as a coach. In other words, the negative in the context that the team still got to improve. The other thing you find is, particularly if you're working with program teams and leadership teams, they quite often ask you about consulting. In your experience, what is it that you think we should do? And that is not teaching, it's not mentoring, it is pure consulting. You're saying to them, well, based on my experience at XYZ company, I recommend that you do this. So I've been doing consulting activities this afternoon at British Telecom, talking about a big program that we're trying to separate between the behavioral change and the software delivery elements in the program. So those 8 elements then of our Agile Coaching Framework, that teaching, mentoring, facilitating, if you notice, I've put the S1, S2, S3, S4 against it. And the reason why I've done that is because it is recognized in things like situational leadership and so on to be certain stances. And I'm going to talk to you about that stance at the moment. But first of all, let's look at the amount of content that a coach is providing. If the bottom triangle, providing subject knowledge, is, you know, all of your content in the teaching mode.
John?
Yeah.
Are you perhaps sharing a screen? Because I can't see anything on my side.
Anybody else with the same problem?
No,
I can see it.
It's very
No, screen is good.
fine. Good.
I can see it.
Okay, so whoever it is, if you go out and come back in again, I think you'll find it.
Okay.
All right, sorry about that.
No problem.
Okay, so if you think about the subject matter knowledge in teaching, a coach is providing virtually all the content. If you go to the other extent where you're coaching, in other words, the team are providing the direction and you're just asking powerful questions and enabling them and so on, then what you'll find is the team is providing the content and you're providing very little. And there's a gradual sort of, I don't know whether it's a straight line, but there's less and less content as you move from left to right. So the S1, S2, S3, S4 is all about the situational leadership. A guy called Ken Blanchard invented situational leadership, and he made a book fairly famous in the 1980s, 1990s called The 1 Minute Manager. And according to Blanchard, what we're doing is we're matching the intervention with the competency and commitment of the team. So if you're thinking about introducing a team first to a topic, you would use a teaching intervention to do that. Okay, so they don't know what, I don't know, ATDD or BDD is, so you would start to teach them about that before you actually went into a mentoring mode. If you're starting to find people that they've started to understand what you've talked to them about and you need to reinforce or correct the training, then you're using a mentoring mode. And when I talk about mentoring and teaching in a few minutes, in a few slides more, we're going to actually discuss what is the difference between mentoring and teaching and so on. Okay. What you're doing is in S3 is a facilitating mode. You would use facilitating when the team wants to start to experiment. So the classic place where you're facilitating would be in a retrospective, for example, or a sprint planning where you're just providing them with a bit of backbone, a bit of knowledge. You might ask a few questions, but essentially the team is driving the process. Okay. And last but not least is where the team is starting to take over and they want to experiment themselves. So this would be a point where you would probably, your input and your work would be to ask powerful questions, but you would not be going to the stage of judgment, because you're allowing the team to start to experiment with their own ways of working. So when we're talking about teaching skills, let's think about how we're doing with teaching skills. The first thing what you've got to do is to understand what it is you're trying to teach them. What skills do they need? And to do that, you need to think about the outcomes. What are you trying to achieve? So when you're thinking about that coaching plan, then you might be saying, what I want to do is to get these teams to start to think about better quality. And one of the ways I'm going to do that is by introducing them to BDD. Most people learn in different ways, and I'll come back to this in a second. So if you're designing a teaching intervention, you have to start to create activities for each of the different learning styles. And I'll come to this in detail in a minute, because it's an important element when you're starting to become a coach as a teacher. Okay. The thing about teaching is that you're not lecturing. In a lecture, the information goes from the speaker to the audience. In training, you're looking at two-way conversations. You might have people doing exercises where they're giving feedback. You might do a lot of different activities in order to encourage people to start to think about the content that you're asking them to learn. The other, number 5, is about using different delivery mechanisms. So what you need to do is to obviously have good presentation skills, and you might want videos, you might do sound activities, you might do drawings, you might do all sorts of things. But if you start, and particularly in this virtual age, if you use the same delivery mechanism all the time, a team will get very, very fed up with you after 2 or 3 hours. The other thing that I think you need to think about is digestible pieces of learning. There's a lot of information to say that people learn most by doing. Okay, there's something called the 70-20-10 rule, and 10 is about the lecture content, 20 is about watching other people, but the 70% is by doing. So the concept of training a whole team for 2 days and then kicking them off is probably not a good way to do it. So you might want to break that learning up into digestible pieces. So for example, you might say, let's train teach them about having a social contract, and then get them to do it. And then you might say, right, let's teach them about agile ways of working and then get them to do it. Let's teach them about sprint planning, then get them to do it. So in that digestible pieces, you might in fact say, instead of something being a 2-day course, you might break it up over, let's say 10 segments in order to get the team to learn and do and reinforce, learn and do, and so on. The other thing that you have to do when you're training is to check for understanding, and there are lots of different ways of doing that. You might get people to do feedback, you might get people to do questionnaires, you might get people to reflect on the end of each exercise to decide what they actually need and need to have. On the other hand, you need to look at how the training is. I've got an echo. Is looking at how that training sticks. Okay, so let's look at the next slide. I've mentioned learning styles. Honey and Mumford did some work in 1985, I think, and it was called the Learning Styles. And they've got a questionnaire that you can fill out. If anybody wants a copy of that questionnaire, then reach out to me and we'll send it to you after the event. But basically, they define 4 different learning styles, and most of us have a preferred learning style and a secondary learning style. So there's a group they called activists, and activists like to be learning by doing. And so what you would need to do if you have activists is to use problem solving and role plays and those sort of things in order to get your people to learn. If you've got theorists, these are the people that need facts and concepts and models, and you can use frameworks and you can give them a lot of background information as to why they should be doing something. So a theorist, for example, you would need to want to explain to the theorist about, you know, empirical control in Scrum, and you'd need to maybe take them back to the Deming out of the crisis material and so on. The pragmatists are the people that like to watch other people learning, and they want to experiment, they want to try out new things, they want time to think about the concepts, and they also want to be able to try something out. They want to be able to experiment. And then the last group are what they call the reflectors. And when you're designing training programs, it's important to give those people time to reflect. So when you're doing a training course and somebody says to you, right, we've just finished that lesson, would you like to write down the key points from your perspective, or would you like to talk about the key points with your peer group or breakout group or whatever words they use? Then that is where the trainer is giving those participants time to reflect. Okay. The last thing I'd like to say to you is there's a very, very nice book called Training from the Back of the Class. And in Training from the Back of the Class is a lot of different tools and techniques and so on. But the basic tool is what they call the 4C reference guide. And this is when you're starting to talk to people about new things, talk to them about what they already know, and then tell them what the concept is, building on the connection that they've already got. Once you've started with the concepts, then you can start to look at practical exercises in order to give their concrete experiences. And then you can start to draw conclusions. So this 4C's guide gives you a bit of a framework that you can actually look at your planned training intervention and start to work out, is this the right type of training to do? Somebody said, oh, well, we just send our people and they go off to Scrum Master or Safe Inc. and they get a standard course. From a training perspective, from a coaching perspective, when those people come back, they have only learned the generic approach to Scrum or the generic approach to Safe. There is no doubt that you will need, as a coach, to train those people further in different tools and techniques, in the way in which your organization wants to do things. Okay, so there is always an element of training, and many coaches sort of think, oh, we don't need to bother with training because I've got a certified Scrum Master. But if you analyze what the certification means, you'll find that there are big gaps in their knowledge base. So, for example, in Scrum, there's nothing about quality management techniques. There's nothing about peer programming. It's only all about the Scrum and the empirical control process. If you look at SAFe and you can do SAFe training, then you might learn about PI planning, and you might work about dependency management, and you might look about release trains, but you don't learn about how to ensure the quality. There's nothing about ATDD in SAFe and so on, unless you go into some of the specialist courses. So the reason why I'm stressing the coach as a trainer is I think I find myself training probably 30% of my time is probably training rather than coaching. Mentoring is about taking the advice that you've already given the team, or that they've learned from videos or from courses, and then standing by the side of them and helping them understand what they need to do in the context of their current situation. So it's always contextual mentoring. It's always about giving advice to those people. But don't forget, a coach is a person that helps a team perform. It's not a person who does the work of the team. So it's always about giving advice. You might do a small illustration, but at some point with the mentoring, you need to step back, because again, going back to the 70-20-10 rule, 70% of the learning happens when people do things. So this is quite important. So mentoring is used when the team is confident of the content, but unsure how to progress in their current context. They may have forgotten something or not been quite sure of something, and you need to reassure them and help them move on down the path. Mentoring can be in the form of a short intervention. I was talking to a Scrum Master yesterday, and he said he tries to take an intervention at the end of each Scrum. I think that's a bit too frequent, but he says that he's always doing some form of mentoring or some form of coaching in every daily stand-up, and I think that will. I'm glad his teams have got the time to do that, but I think that if you're not, I believe God gave us 2 eyes, 2 ears, and 1 mouth for a reason, and that is you need to take more observing, you need to take more listening before you start to speak. So I like the approach of reflecting, stepping back, looking at a situation, thinking about it from 2 or 3 angles before I decide what the intervention is that I'm going to make. Mentoring typically reinforces the knowledge already given to the team. It's nearly always that way around. So mentoring is always based in Agile Wisdom. You always taking the people back to core Agile, and I don't mean by that the Agile Manifesto or the values or anything like that, but core Agile in the context of where they are as a team. So, more sophisticated teams would have more sophisticated core Agile. The novice teams would be back to the basics, okay? The mentoring has to be aligned with your coaching contract. That is the agreement that you've got as a coach with your team as to what they're expecting for you to do. You need to understand the change cycle. In other words, that you apply the growth models, and we're going to, at the end of this course, this session, talk about the grow model to mentor people where they are in their journey. So you can't just pick them up and say, well, you've done this, but now we think you can do that, and we'll mentor them. You have to take them back to basics and start to train. Be aware of the role transitions. As you're adopting Agile, so people's jobs are changing, typically, okay? And that means that they have an emotional attachment, they have a degree of uncertainty, they are unsure maybe of the future, they don't know where their job now fits into the hierarchy of the organization, and that means you need to be very careful about the emotions that may come into play. And typically those emotions don't come out in training. The emotions come out when you're mentoring, because then you get the pushback and they say, but I understand that you want T-shaped individuals, but I'm a testing specialist and there's no way I'm going to do whatever it was you're going to ask them. You need to think about their expertise. You need to clarify the connection between your expertise and the mentoring situation. And one of the ways of doing that is to use what I'll call war stories or examples to enable people to visualize what you're telling the people. So trying to use the more color rather than just the words, giving people the ability to visualize something else is an important part of mentoring. You will always find the mentoring in our situation is typically where you first find the resistance. Resistance rather than as I don't want to do this because and you need to work through those people as saying that the resistance is a learning opportunity rather than an indication of your failure or their failure. So you will always find it doesn't tend to happen in the training situation because you're in a formal classroom. In mentoring, it's much more informal, and so that's when you tend to get the pushback and the resistance. I would say when dealing with resistance, used evidence-based approaches. So there's a whole group of techniques called evidence-based management. I love it. So you can actually say to these guys, this is the data from Agile Wisdom. Projects deliver, I don't know, 70% faster or whatever it is. And you can say that's the generic piece. Now, why don't we try something to see if we can get somewhere near that? Or this team over here has got this scenario, they're doing it. Is there a reason why we can't copy them or do something similar or whatever? You also, in the mentoring scenario, just as in the training scenario, you need to check people are understanding, because new concepts don't always land very well. And what you need to do is to use some of those teaching training techniques in order to check that people understand. And obviously, giving them an example or helping them do something, I don't know, sprint planning, for example, and then standing back and watching them do it is obviously a way of checking for understanding. Facilitating is kind of interesting because your job is to try and make something more easy for them and to help them move forward. And it could be with an action, an event. It could be in a situation where they're doing a demonstration or something. In this scenario, the team is responsible. The team is always responsible, of course, but the team is responsible. And the coach enables them by giving them process or techniques. I've just witnessed a lot of the coaches in BT create a lot of mural boards so that they can start to walk through situations with their teams. And in that way, in building that mural board, that is a kind of facilitating. And then what they do is they talk the team through the mural board, and then the team actually goes away and does it. And in it, an exercise or a decision making or so on. So facilitating is used when the team understands a situation, but it may well be they're cautious about a way forward, or you want to help them to open their minds to a new set of circumstances. So this is always an opportunity to use facilitation techniques. If there's inconsistent views in the team, so for example, say the team is in conflict mode over task, you might use a facilitating technique to say, okay, Fred, you're saying that we shouldn't do this. What are you suggesting we do? And then you say, okay, Joe, you or Josephine, you said that you don't like that suggestion by Fred. So what are your alternatives? And let's talk about that. And let's give you an example. Let's work through it. And in that way of asking the questions, the coach is facilitating. As we transition away from traditional practices, then what you might find is that the team previously got told to do things. So you will use this technique, you will not use that technique. When we start to open the book of, the team is self-managing, then you may be able to get the team to start to think out of the box and start to think about what are the alternatives, what better ways could we use, what type of techniques could we follow, all of those sort of questions. So facilitating is very, very interesting. I've been reading some books by a guy called Richard Hackman, and in that book they talk about facilitating process. If we're talking about interpersonal type facilitation activities of the coach, they've rated that in terms of performance improvement. If we're training at the early stage of the project team life cycle or the task or the sprint, then training in process and training in interpersonal skills has roughly the same effect, and they scored that as a 1. When they're doing in the middle of the cycle, coaching about the interpersonal skills again scores a 1. But when you start to talk about task, then it scores a 7 in terms of their improvement in productivity. So I think what we can do is to think about, if there's conflict over the task scenario, then this might be a place where we're starting to use our facilitating or mentoring skills. So basically facilitation, again, you need to think about the outcome, and typically the outcome will be defined in a facilitation mode as much by the team as it is by you. You'll need to think about the flow of the activities, because typically you can't get them from where they are today to where you want them to get to. You need to have a series of steps and activities that encourage the team to start to think about how to achieve their outcomes and so on. As a coach, we need to step on the process, but not on the judgment or not on the content, and allow them to do that and allow them to explore. You might give them questions, of course, open questions, powerful questions, and so on, in order to help them, but you still stay out the process in terms of a coach. Coming to decisions is always a critical part of team working, and enabling them to be aware of their decision making, stopping them, putting the boundaries around them. Every agile team is usually part of an organization, and it's not usually able to make certain decisions in the context of that organization. So if you start to see a team stepping outside the boundaries, for example, let's break the expense policy, or let's hire some more bodies, and you know darn well that the organization's got some controls around that, then obviously as a coach, in order to avoid frustration, you'd be saying to them, hang on guys, I don't think we can do that. So making sure that they understand their boundaries is a fundamental part of the facilitation skills. You need to create a collaboration space. That could be a physical space, it could be a virtual space like a mural, but basically allows that team to share ideas, where they can talk to each other, build trust, foster trust, and welcome different points of view. So some of the things that you might want to think about when you're starting to move the team into facilitation mode is, have you set the ground rules about what facilitation means? You might want to give them training about giving and receiving feedback in order to enable them to do the facilitation techniques effectively and efficiently. The other thing you've got to do as a coach is to look at the people that are sat in the corner. A great coach at BT, Steve, said about the listening skills and the 3 different listening skills. As a coach, you've got to look at the all body listening or full listening, full attention listening, where you're starting to see where the people are and making sure that their body language and their words correlate with being fully involved, engaged, and ideas can flow freely as a result. So you don't want somebody metaphorically sitting there with their arms crossed, staring out the window when you're trying to do a facilitation session. Encourage the collaboration, ask the questions, improve the conversation. Sometimes a coach might have to go to the absurd side to say, well, what about if we did this? And the team might go, that John, that's stupid. We can't do that. So then you can go back and say, well, what could we do then? And what you've done is you've broken the mold by asking a stupid question, and you can bring them back then, or they will bring you back to what they think are possible. And I think this is always a question with facilitation, is about getting the teams to understand the possible rather than think already within the box, and the last thing is fairly obvious, but you'd be surprised how many teams I've seen that they do a facilitation session and they don't record the outcome and they don't follow up on it. So I think as a coach, what you need to do is I think every team needs to have a bit of a workbook that records, you know, what things they've done, the feedback they've got from a sprint review or a product review. What are the things they've tried in terms of a retrospective, in terms of experiments and so on. That sort of could be a wiki, it could be a Excel spreadsheet, it could be a mural. But I think the teams need to have that so they can go back and think about what it is that they have agreed, and then of course then a bit later on they can look at that board or look at that mural or look at whatever it is and say, did we actually achieve what we set out to achieve? The last thing tends to be, if you do an IC Agile course, there's a lot of emphasis on professional coaching. I think from my experience since 2007, I think I spend very little time doing one-to-one coaching, which is what professional coaching is about. I think I can count on one hand the number of real coaching sessions I have done. I've done a lot of team coaching. I would say the majority of my time is in that mentoring and facilitating space. So basically, when you're in team coaching mode, you've got to believe that the team is truly in a place where they can actually make decisions for themselves. In other words, that they're mature enough to do that and so on. And I think it's quite a challenging ground because it requires you as a coach to trust and honor the team's decisions. And if you think the team has made the wrong decision, sometimes we step in and actually what we do then is we prevent them from learning. So I think this whole thing about learn fast and pivot, I hate the term fail fast, but I think this, as a coach, you might, you've grown up with this team, you might think them as your team, and you're emotionally attached to them, so you don't really want them to make mistakes. But you've got to remember that part of Agile is that we learn from mistakes, and that's a good thing, not a bad thing. So coaching a team from a professional space knows that you're not teaching, you're not giving them your wisdom, but what you're doing is helping them to build their wisdom. Now, what's very interesting is I think that, if you've got a more mature team, they may have decided to do something which clearly isn't working when you start to look at the metrics or the data. And then what you might need to do is then bring them back to core Agile by doing some training or some intervention in order to bring them back to some of the principles or practices or so on. But that's not to say you don't allow them to experiment, because, hey, guess what? They might be in a context where your knowledge and their wisdom is at conflicts, and it might be that they're doing the right thing for them and your view is probably, it may not be the right one. So this is why I think it's quite a testing intervention to run from a coaching perspective. I think, the professional coaching piece is definitely something where people would you need to allow the team to go and lead. It's like, if I can use an analogy, when you're teaching a child to ride a two-wheel bicycle, and you start off with stabilizers, and you take the stabilizers off, and then the dad runs down the street or mum runs down the street holding onto the saddle. At some point, you have to let that saddle go, unless you're going to run behind them for the next 20 years every time they get on a bike. So it's the same with a team, right? And we both all know, if you've got children and you've let them go in that way, and you've let them do things, you're very nervous when you're doing it. And a team coach is exactly the same, and it's always, an emotionally difficult thing to do, and letting them experiment and so on. We had a conversation this afternoon talking about splitting a program between a delivery piece and a cultural change piece, and they were asking me to make the decision, and I turned around and said to them, look, you need to think about the decision, you need to decide what's right for you. I can tell you, if you're going to do this is the best techniques to use, or you're going to do that, these are the best techniques to use, but eventually it's your decision. And I think that's what we've got to remember, is that even in the facilitating and the team coaching side, the job of the coach is to let the team make the decision. We tend to forget that the job of the coach is to work his or her way out of a job, right? Because what you've done is you've passed on your knowledge. The teams understand where to go to get advice. They understand where to get more information, and they've probably started to practice things and so on. So those are the intervention techniques, and coaching. You need to start to think about something called emotional intelligence. You need to think about your self-awareness. You need to think about your self-management for this bit about being nervous about letting go. You need to make sure that you retain your presence. One of the coaches this afternoon said to me, I lost it with this team. You need to keep out of that emotional attachment, and you definitely build rapport and so on, but you don't let yourself get sucked into the actual argument, and you don't get the emotion piece into it. You definitely, in a coaching mode, you're listening more than hearing. You're listening more than you are speaking, and your job is to open up the people's eyes to other actual possibilities through open, powerful questions. So basically what you do is you invite them to inspect or introspect or think of all the alternatives and reveal other solutions. You might need, again, to prepare that team about giving and receiving feedback, because in that coaching mode, teams typically get very emotional. There's a lot of high energy in a coaching scenario because they can feel themselves going in a certain direction. So again, you might need to remind them about the facilitation skills within the team and the giving and receiving feedback, and you might need to remind them about trust and respect and all of those sort of things. And I don't think it's out of order in a coaching scenario to point out if somebody's crossing the boundaries of interpersonal behaviors such that they are stopping the team from making a decision and so on. So I think you can do that. I think you might be careful. It might break some of the coaching guidelines, but if you see a scenario that is coming out, you might want to perhaps take somebody out of the room and talk to them about what they've just done or what they've just said or whatever. But you need to do that. You might break them thing for a coffee or something and talk to them then. You need to make sure that they understand what the issue is that they're working, because they get high energy, because they get high emotion. You need to make sure that they understand, and they truly understand what problem they are trying to solve. And being explicit about the problem is nearly 90% of the battle, because once they understand what the problem is that they're trying to solve, then it allows them to do the issue exploration. If they're unsure of the problem, then obviously you get people going off in all sorts of directions, and it makes the exploration and the decision making that much more difficult. If you think about the action orientated, the coaching conversation is allowing the team to actually make their own decisions. So that's about coaching. There's a lot more information around coaching on the websites and so on, but I would say to you, in terms of my experience anyway, that I spend a lot more of my time training and mentoring, and pretty often I do facilitation, but it's rare that I'm doing individual coaching. I quite often do team coaching, particularly at senior level. So when we're looking at Scrum, let's look at where we really are getting into a coaching mode. Obviously, what I've done is I've drawn the Scrum as a linear piece, and the feedback is obviously going through the retrospective after the sprint review. In the Scrum Guide 2020, oops. Oh, it disappeared. Sorry. In the Scrum Guide 2020, what we found is that it says that the retrospective is a means of looking at the team's effectiveness and the team's quality. So when you're starting to run retrospectives, it's not just the 3 questions, which really irritate me, but it's more about how can we improve the effectiveness, how can we improve the quality of what we're delivering, and so on. So you typically find that a lot of the coaching that you do is around that intervention, that team starting to say, okay, how can we do better, and in prompting them to start to think about how they can do better. There's another model which I'll let you see, and which I'll let you have when you get a copy of this deck. It's about what's called the Kesembucksmith model, okay? And this is about looking at 3 areas: performance results, collective work products, and personal growth. And what, in order to get these things working in a team, you need to start to think about their skills, their accountability, and their commitment. Now, when you start to look at this model, then you start to think about, okay, what can I start to change? So if we're looking at the retrospective and we're starting to see that the team is not necessarily all hooked up on the same approach, or they're not hooked up on the product and sprint goals, then you might want to do some commitment coaching or some purpose coaching. If you're looking at the accountability, you might want to draw up a RACI of who's accountable for what, because don't forget, Scrum only says you've got a product owner and a Scrum Master and a team member. It says nothing about quality or reporting or compliance or whatever. So there's always something that you've got to add to that team in terms of coaching. So I find this model quite useful in order to start to think about what type of things do I need to build. You know, the commitment type training is different to the skills type training, and the accountability. So it would be a different type of intervention that you would run. Lastly, I use something called the GROW model. And the GROW model really starts from the goal. So the GROW model might start you by saying, okay, when you've got a brand new team, what type of team do you want to be? You know, do you want to be renowned for being super technical, for being right every time? Do you want for building product quickly, for building high quality product? What type of team do you want to be? And what type of goal do you want? What type of aspiration do you want to have within your team? The next piece of GROW is the R, which is reality. So what is our current situation? So if the team says we really want to deliver defect-free software, so what is the current situation and what are the inhibitors? So let's say, okay, they do some analysis and they say, at every sprint we're getting I don't know, 20 escape defects. So okay, what's the current situation? What's inhibiting us for getting down to 0 defects? And they may say, well, we haven't got the right tool, we haven't quite got the acceptance criteria correct, or whatever. So that's their reality. And then you start to explore options, and this is where your powerful questions come in. So exploring the options allows the team to start to think about what they could do in order to solve the problem, in order to reach the goal that they've set themselves. Okay, and that allows them to then start to think about what things can we start to do, what things can we start to change. And the last piece is, okay, let's have the will. Are we agreeing which experiments we're going to do? I love the less concept of try and experiment. If you've got a problem, try and experiment. And so this is what the team has agreed we're going to do. And don't forget, if they're going to change something, what is going to be their anticipated outcome. So last sprint they did, let's say, 40 story points. This sprint they're going to change something, and how many more story points are we going to get from that? Maybe 4, maybe 5, maybe 2. So this allows them to agree specific actions and specific deadlines, and they give the accountability. So you've got a product backlog, but this GROW model is almost about the improvement backlog, which allows the team to start to think about how we're going to get better and so on. What I would say to you is there's a wonderful concept which Al Shalloway talks about, which is about the pick up sticks concept. You know, the pick up sticks games, you can't pick up all the sticks at one time. And as a coach, we've got lots of things that we might want to do with a team. And we've got to remember that people have got to have time to learn. People have got to have time to do the job. They've got to have time to complete their sprints. And that means that you can't do everything all at once. So it's always a question of deciding which thing to go for first and use that pick up sticks concept in order to get to the right result. So I think that's the session. Next time, what we're going to do is to look at retrospectives. This is a session in April 14th. We're going to run another session like this. The retrospective is, I think, probably the most difficult event on the Scrum list of events, 5 events. And yet it's also the most important because, or probably after product backlog, it's a backlog refinement is the most important. And yet we always get, people say, oh, I'm having really difficulty with retrospectives. So I've got some people lined up and they're doing experiments with different types of retrospectives at the moment. So in this webinar, the next one in April, what I'm hoping to do is to get 2 or 3 coaches to come in and talk about the experiment that they've run in their organization so that we can share some ideas and so on. But I really think we've got to get to grips with retrospectives. And that's why the next session. That's the end of my presentation.